The first alert buzzed against my hip at 4:47 in the morning, 3 days after my heart attack, and I almost didn't feel it under the blankets and the four-line and the general fog of whatever they still had dripping into my arm. Fraud alert. Attempted withdrawal of $58,000 declined. Dual authorization required. I was still staring at the screen, trying to make my eyes focus on numbers that didn't make sense yet, when I heard my son's voices out in the hallway low, thinking the door was closed further than it was. "He's not going to remember any of this," Ryan was saying. "He was barely conscious yesterday. We split it. It's done before he's even out of here. And by the time he's asking questions, we've already moved it somewhere he can't touch." I want to tell you that my first thought was betrayal. It wasn't. My first thought, lying in a hospital bed with a heart that had nearly stopped 72 hours earlier, was, thank God I set this up 11 years ago, because I knew this exact conversation would happen to someone, someday. I just never let myself believe it would be about me. Let me back up, because to understand how two men I raised myself ended up standing in a hospital hallway, calculating how fast they could move their unconscious father's retirement fund, you need to understand a woman named Doris Kowalski, and a mistake I watched her make 11 years before I nearly made one of my own. My name is Gerald. I'm 71 years old, and for 34 years I was a firefighter, the last 11 of them as captain of Engine 14, before I retired the same month my wife Diane was diagnosed with the illness that would take her 2 years later. I've lived in the same 3-bedroom house on Larkspur Street since 1987. I still mow my own lawn. I drive a Ford that's older than most of my grandchildren, and my idea of a splurge is the good coffee instead of the store brand. 34 years of a firefighter's pension, careful investing in a modest index fund. Diane insisted we start when the boys were small, and the sale of a rental property her mother left us added up, over 4 decades, to a retirement fund worth just under $340,000. It's not a fortune. It's not meant to be won. It's meant to cover whatever's left of my life without my sons ever having to choose between their own families and taking care of their old man. And that was the entire and only point of it. 11 years ago, my neighbor Doris Kowalski, a widow 2 doors down who'd been like a second mother to my boys growing up, had a stroke. While she was in rehab for 6 weeks, her nephew, the only family member who lived close enough to help, quietly moved $18,000 out of her savings account, told the bank he had her verbal permission over the phone, and had spent most of it by the time Doris was well enough to notice her statements didn't add up. The bank shrugged. The nephew claimed a misunderstanding. Doris was never able to prove intent, and she spent the last 4 years of her life in a smaller apartment than the one she planned for, because the money that would have covered the difference was gone. I sat with Doris more than once during that stretch, listening to her describe the exact moment she understood what had happened. Not the theft itself, but the specific, sick recalibration of realizing the person who did it had been family the whole time, someone she trusted precisely because trusting him had never once felt like a risk. I remember telling Diane, the week after, that I never wanted either of us to find out what that recalibration felt like from the inside. Diane, practical to the end, said the only real defense against that kind of blindness wasn't trusting people less. It was building a system that didn't depend on trust holding up perfectly for everyone all the time, including the people you loved most. So we built one. Our credit union at the time, Cornerstone Federal, had a program for exactly this. Dual authorization holds on any withdrawal over a set threshold, real-time text alerts to a second, independent phone number, and a designated trusted contact with alert-only access, someone who couldn't move a dollar themselves, but who'd be notified the instant anything unusual happened. Diane and I picked her older brother, my former fire captain and closest friend for 40 years, a man named Frank Milan, to be that second set of eyes. We told the boys about the general shape of our finances over the years. We never told them about the dual authorization setup or about Frank's role in it, Because the entire design only works if the person attempting to move money doesn't know there's a second gate they haven't accounted for. I hadn't thought about that system in years. I'd almost forgotten I still had it. Ryan and Nathan are my twins, 36 years old, and I want to say clearly that I don't believe either of them woke up one morning and decided to become the kind of men who do what they did. Life pulled them in different directions the way it does most siblings, even ones who shared a womb. And by the time all this happened, those directions had drifted further apart than I'd let myself fully notice. Nathan is steady, a high school shop teacher, married, 2 kids, a mortgage he pays on time, the kind of quiet, responsible life that never makes for an interesting phone call, but that I've always been proud of in the specific way you're proud of something you don't have to worry about. Ryan is the one who inherited my restlessness without inheriting my caution. He opened a restaurant 7 years ago with money he'd borrowed against nearly everything he owned, watched it fail slowly over 3 brutal years, and has spent the time since cycling through smaller ventures and larger debts, each one dressed up, when he talked to me about it, as the thing that was finally going to turn things around. I helped him twice early on, with amounts that felt significant to me, and I suspect felt insufficient to him. $8,000 toward equipment financing the first time, $11,000 toward a supplier debt the second. Both times I told him it was the last time, and both times I meant it a little less than I should have, because he's my son, and watching your child drown is a specific kind of helpless that doesn't respond well to principle. The small dismissals started showing up maybe 3 years ago, mostly from Ryan, mostly disguised as concern. Comments about whether I should really still be driving at night. A joke, more than once, about how I'd want to make sure everything's in order given that I wasn't getting any younger. At Nathan's daughter's 10th birthday last spring, Ryan asked me, in front of the whole family, whether I'd thought about simplifying things by adding one of them to my accounts directly, just in case something happened. I told him I had a plan already in place and left it at that. I didn't tell him what the plan actually was. I've since been grateful for that instinct more than almost any other one I've had in years. Nathan never pushed the way Ryan did. But Nathan also never pushed back either. Not when Ryan raised the subject at family dinners. Not when Ryan started asking me pointed questions about the house's value. Not even, as I learned later, when Ryan first floated the idea of what to do if Dad ever ended up in the hospital and couldn't manage things himself. Nathan's failure wasn't cruelty. It was the much quieter failure of a man who let his brother's certainty stand in for his own judgment, because disagreeing with Ryan had always been more exhausting than going along with him. There's one more thing worth mentioning about that period, because it's the detail I keep returning to. Ryan's wife, Priya, called me privately about 8 months before the heart attack. Worried, she said, about how stressed Ryan had become over money he wouldn't discuss with her directly. She asked, carefully, whether I had any idea how deep it went. I didn't. Not really, and I told her so. I wish now that conversation had made me curious enough to ask Ryan directly instead of simply filing it away as one more thing to keep an eye on. I've had to make peace with the fact that hindsight hands you clarity it never once offered you in the moment. The heart attack happened on a Tuesday morning in my own kitchen, and the only reason I'm telling you this story at all is that Doris Kowalski's old house, the 1-2 doors down, now belongs to a young couple with a dog that barks at exactly 6:15 every morning, and the wife happened to be out front when I stumbled onto my porch trying to reach my phone and instead reached the railing, then the ground. She called 911. My old crew, Engine 14, wasn't the one that responded, but I like to think they'd have been proud of how fast the response was anyway. I don't remember most of the first 2 days. I remember fragments, a mask over my face, Diane's name coming out of my own mouth at some point, though she's been gone 6 years, Nathan's face close to mine at one point, saying something I couldn't hold on to. By the 3rd day, I was stable, sedated on and off for pain and rest, lucid in stretches that got longer as the days went on, but still, by any reasonable measure, a man who looked and sounded like he might not be entirely himself. That's the window Ryan decided to use. I've pieced together what happened over the following weeks, partly from what Frank told me, partly from the bank's records, and partly, eventually, from Nathan himself. Ryan told Nathan on the second day that with Dad out of it and no formal power of attorney in place for finances, they needed to protect the retirement fund before, in his words, some scammer or a bad decision on his part while he's confused, put at risk. He proposed splitting the $340,000 between two new accounts, one under each of their names, framing it not as taking the money, but as temporarily safeguarding it until I recovered. Nathan, exhausted, frightened, and, I believe this honestly, not thinking clearly himself after 2 days at his father's hospital bedside, agreed. They went to Cornerstone Federal on the third day, presenting themselves as my sons acting in my best interest, requesting a transfer they described as urgent. The branch manager, a woman who'd known our family for years, told them, apologetically, that a hold of this size would need additional verification given the account settings, and that she'd need to follow up before releasing anything. Ryan pushed back, according to what she later told Frank, growing visibly frustrated in a way that struck her as unusual for a family she'd always known to be easygoing. What neither of them knew, because I never told them, was that any withdrawal over $10,000 on that account had required a second authorization for 11 years, tied to a phone number that wasn't mine. Frank called me that afternoon, the third day, his voice tight in a way I'd only heard a handful of times in 40 years of friendship. He told me the bank had flagged 2 large withdrawal attempts within an hour of each other. Both declined pending dual authorization, both requested in person by men who'd identified themselves as my sons. He asked me, carefully, whether I'd authorized anything. I told him no. I told him to hold everything and say nothing to anyone until I'd had a chance to think. That night was the one where I heard them in the hallway. I'd been drifting, not quite asleep, when Ryan and Nathan stepped just outside my door to talk, the way people do when they think a hospital room door provides more privacy than it actually does. He's not going to remember any of this, Ryan said. He was barely conscious yesterday. We split it. It's done before he's even out of here. And by the time he's asking questions, we've already moved it somewhere he can't touch. I don't know, Ryan, Nathan said. And I could hear, even through the door, that his voice had the particular strain of a man trying to convince himself of something he no longer believed. The bank manager seemed weird about it. What if Dad finds out? He's not going to find out, Ryan said. And even if he does, we'll just say we were protecting it, which we were, technically. I lay there for a long moment after they walked away, my heart doing something I'm fairly sure my cardiologist would not have approved of, and then I picked up my phone and called Frank back. Freeze everything, I told him. Both requests. And I want a full log of every attempt, time-stamped, sent to my email and to yours. Already done, Gerald, Frank said. I've been sitting on it since the first alert, waiting to hear your voice sound like your voice again before I said anything. It does now. I spent the rest of that night doing something I hadn't expected to be capable of 3 days removed from a cardiac event. I thought clearly and specifically about what I actually wanted to happen next. Not punishment, not exactly. I wanted to understand how much of what I just heard was Ryan's fear talking, and how much of it was something colder that had been sitting underneath the fear the whole time. I didn't confront them from the hospital bed. I wanted to be standing on my own feet, in my own kitchen for what came next, and I was patient enough, after everything, to wait the 11 days it took to get there. I asked both of them to come by 2 days after I got home, telling them only that I wanted to talk about next steps. They arrived expecting, I think, a conversation about home health aides, or maybe a delicate conversation about whether I should still be living alone. Instead, I set 3 printouts on the kitchen table. The transaction log, timestamped down to the minute, showing both attempted withdrawals, both declines, and both their names as the requesting parties. Ryan's face did the same thing I imagined Doris Kowalski's nephew's face never had to do, because nobody had ever caught him with a printed log. Nathan's face did something worse, in a way. Not shock, but the slow arrival of shame, the look of a man watching his own choices laid out in a font he couldn't argue with. "I heard you both in the hallway," I said before either of them could start explaining. "I heard exactly what you said, Ryan, about how I wasn't going to remember, and exactly what you said back, Nathan, about whether I'd find out. So I'm going to ask you not to tell me you were protecting anything. I'd rather you just tell me the truth about what you were actually afraid of." Ryan, to his credit, didn't try to run the protecting it line a second time. He told me, haltingly, that he owed close to $60,000 to two different lenders, that a collector had started calling his workplace, and that somewhere in the panic of watching me collapse on my own porch, protecting the money and needing, the money had blurred together in a way he still couldn't fully account for, even to himself. Nathan told me he'd known, the whole time, that it felt wrong, and that he'd gone along with it anyway, because standing up to his brother in a hospital hallway had felt, in that exhausted moment, harder than staying quiet. I didn't press charges. Frank thought I should at least consider it, given how deliberately Ryan had planned it. But I've buried a wife and watched a neighbor's dignity get quietly dismantled by this exact kind of math before, and I decided I'd rather spend what time I have left rebuilding something than proving a point in a courtroom. What I did instead was restructure things properly, with an actual elder law attorney this time instead of an 11-year-old informal arrangement with Frank. The dual authorization system stays, permanently, on the record, with both boys informed of its existence for the first time. Ryan's debt gets addressed through a structured repayment plan I'm helping him build with an actual financial counselor, not a lump sum, because I've learned the hard way that money handed to an unaddressed problem just becomes a slightly larger problem with better disguise. Nathan and I have talked more honestly in the 2 months since than we had in the previous 10 years, mostly about the cost of his particular kind of quiet and what it might look like for him to trust his own judgment even when his brother's certainty is louder in the room. Frank still gets the alerts. I told him I don't plan on taking his name off that account as long as I'm alive, and he told me, in the dry way he said everything to me for 40 years, that he'd expected as much and had already saved the number of every hospital in the county to his phone, just in case. Priya called me again about 6 weeks after everything settled, this time not worried but relieved, telling me that Ryan had started actually talking to her about money for the first time in their marriage instead of managing it alone and quietly. She thanked me for not pressing charges, and I told her the truth, that I hadn't done it for Ryan's sake alone, but because I'd watched what a courtroom does to a family that might still have a chance to repair itself, and I wasn't ready to trade that chance for a verdict. Here's what Doris Kowalski's stolen $18,000 taught me. 11 years before I ever needed the lesson myself. The people who take advantage of a family member at their most vulnerable rarely think of themselves as thieves. They think of themselves as managing an emergency temporarily on behalf of someone who can't manage it themselves, right up until the moment someone else's careful, boring, unglamorous planning proves that story wrong. I didn't survive that hospital hallway conversation because I outsmarted my sons. I survived it because 11 years earlier, grieving a neighbor's loss, I built a system that didn't need me to be awake, alert, or even conscious to still protect what Diane and I had spent 40 years building. That's not a story about catching two men doing something wrong. It's a story about what it actually means to plan for rain long before the sky looks like it's going to. If you've ever built a safeguard you hoped you'd never need, or found out too late that you should have, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe because there are a lot more quiet systems, hospital hallways, and overdue reckonings still to come. I'll see you in the next one.